The rain wasn't just falling, it was punishing the harsh Texas earth. Caleb had sworn off the world, burying his heart along with his tragic past. But when a desperate, ragged cry pierces the howling wind, he finds a woman who brings the storm right to his doorstep, and a secret that could kill them both. The year was 1888, and the Texas Hill Country was drowning under a relentless, blinding deluge. The Brazos River had already breached its banks, swallowing up the lowlands and turning the trails into treacherous rivers of churning red mud. Caleb Weston rode through the torrential downpour, his wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low, channeling a stream of water off the brim. He was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited, weathered, silent, and relentlessly hard. At 35, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too many harsh winters and buried too many pieces of his soul. Ever since the devastating outbreak of diphtheria swept through Parker County 4 years prior, taking his wife Mary and his infant son in the span of 3 agonizing days, Caleb had retreated from humanity. He lived alone on a rugged, isolated homestead 10 miles outside the town of Weatherford, trading only when necessary and speaking only to his horse, a massive roan gelding named Buster. The wind howled, snapping the branches of the ancient live oaks like dry matchsticks. Caleb was eager to reach the warmth of his cabin, the heavy collar of his oilskin duster turned up against the biting cold. But as Buster navigated a slick, narrow ridge above a rocky ravine, the horse suddenly halted, its ears pinned back, letting out a nervous whinny. Caleb tightened his grip on the reins, his hand instinctively dropping to the cold iron of the Colt single-action army revolver, holstered at his hip. "Easy, boy." "What is it?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp rarely used. He squinted through the sheets of rain. Down in the muddy ditch, half submerged in the rushing water, lay a shattered buckboard wagon. Nearby, a horse lay motionless, and pinned against the splintered wheel of the wagon was a figure. Caleb dismounted instantly, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the muck as he slid down the embankment. When he reached the wreckage, he found a woman. She was unconscious, her calico dress soaked through and plastered to her shivering frame. Her lips were a dangerous, translucent blue, and her dark hair was plastered across a face that was terrifyingly pale. In her death grip, she clutched a heavy, waterlogged leather satchel to her chest. "Mom?" Caleb shouted over the roar of the storm, tapping her cheek. Her skin was like ice. Hypothermia was setting in. She wouldn't last another hour in this exposure. Caleb didn't hesitate. He pried the heavy satchel from her stiff fingers, slung it over his shoulder, and scooped her up into his arms. She was alarmingly light. He scrambled back up the slippery bank, his muscles burning in protest against the mud and the steep incline, and hoisted her gently onto Buster's saddle before climbing up behind her. He held her against his chest to share his body heat, urging the gelding into a dangerous, ground-eating gallop toward his homestead. When they finally reached the cabin, Caleb kicked the heavy oak door open and carried her inside. The hearth was reduced to glowing embers. He laid her on his own cot, quickly shedding his dripping duster, and set to work. He built the fire up until the stone chimney roared with heat, then filled a cast-iron kettle with water from the pump. Survival on the frontier left no room for modesty. Caleb knew she needed to be out of the freezing, wet clothes immediately. Averting his eyes out of respect, he unbuttoned the ruined dress, peeling the freezing fabric away and wrapping her tightly in 2 thick, dry wool blankets. He placed heated stones wrapped in cloth near her feet and chest. For the next 2 days, the storm raged outside, keeping them completely isolated from the rest of the world. And for 2 days, Caleb fought a war against the violent fever that seized the woman's body. He sat by her bedside, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, forcing drops of willow bark tea past her chapped lips. As he watched her struggle, fighting for every breath, unwelcome ghosts crept back into his cabin. He remembered doing this exact same thing for Mary. He remembered the helplessness, the crushing failure. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wooden chair. Not this time, he thought. I won't watch another one die. On the morning of the third day, the relentless drumming of the rain finally ceased, replaced by the heavy, dripping silence of the soaked wilderness. Caleb was at the stove, frying salted pork and boiling coffee, when he heard a rustle of blankets. He turned slowly. She was awake. Her dark eyes were wide, darting around the rustic cabin like a cornered wildcat, before finally landing on him. She pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, her body tense. "Where am I?" Her voice was a hoarse, fragile whisper. "My satchel, where is it?" "You're at my homestead, about 10 miles west of Weatherford," Caleb replied evenly, leaning against the wooden counter, a tin cup of black coffee in his hand. He gestured to the corner of the room. "Your bag is over there." Dry. She exhaled a shaky breath, some of the panic leaving her eyes. "You saved me." "I found you half dead in a ravine," Caleb corrected. "Fever broke in the night. You're lucky to be breathing. I'm Caleb. Caleb Weston." She hesitated, her eyes studying his rugged, bearded face, searching for a threat. Finding only a weary stoicism, she swallowed hard. "I'm Josephine. Josie Miller." "Thank you, Mr. Weston." Caleb nodded once, his face an unreadable mask. "You rest, Miss Miller. Once the roads dry up, I'll hitch the wagon and take you into town. Then we go our separate ways." He turned back to the stove, missing the flicker of absolute terror that flashed across Josie's face at the mention of going into town. 3 days passed. The Texas sun returned, baking the mud into cracked, uneven earth, but the river crossings remained too swollen to risk the journey to Weatherford. A forced, fragile domesticity settled over the cabin. Despite his gruff exterior, Caleb couldn't help but notice the quiet resilience in Josie. As her strength returned, she refused to be a burden. She mended his torn shirts with precise, practiced stitches, cooked hearty stews from his meager pantry, and helped tend to the horses in the corral. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. The silence between them, initially heavy with mutual distrust, began to soften into something almost comfortable. Caleb found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. He noticed the way the firelight caught the auburn strands in her dark hair, and the gentle, sorrowful way she hummed while she worked. He hadn't allowed a woman's presence in his life, or his heart, for 4 agonizing years. The ice around his chest was beginning to crack, and it terrified him. One evening, as the crickets chirped outside the open windows, Josie looked up from the harness she was oiling. "You don't talk much about yourself, Caleb. A man doesn't live out here all alone, this far off the trail, unless he's running from something, or hiding." Caleb stopped whittling the piece of pine in his hands. His jaw tightened. "I ain't hiding, Josie. Just prefer the quiet. Folks have a way of complicating things." "Or breaking your heart," she murmured softly, her eyes falling to the worn gold band still resting on his left ring finger. Caleb looked away, staring into the flames. There was a sickness, diphtheria. Took my wife and boy. After we put him in the ground at the Oakwood Cemetery, I realized I didn't have much use for towns anymore. Josie's eyes softened with genuine empathy. She reached out, her warm, slender hand gently resting over his rough, calloused one. "I am so incredibly sorry, Caleb." For a fleeting moment, Caleb didn't pull away. He looked at her hand, feeling a spark of warmth that he thought had died years ago. He looked into her dark eyes, and for a second, the lonely cowboy felt a dangerous glimmer of hope. But the frontier is a cruel place, and peace is always temporary. The next morning, while Josie was outside drawing water from the well, Caleb decided to sweep the cabin floor. As he moved his broom near the corner where Josie slept, the handle caught the strap of her heavy leather satchel, which had been resting precariously on a wooden stool. The satchel tumbled to the floor. The rusted brass buckle, weakened by the water damage from the storm, snapped. The bag burst open, spilling its contents across the rough-hewn floorboards. Caleb froze. He dropped the broom. It wasn't clothes or personal effects that spilled out. It was money. Stacks upon stacks of crisp, newly minted United States Treasury notes, bound in tight paper bands. And scattered among the cash were official documents stamped with the unmistakable, dreaded crest of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Caleb knelt, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He picked up one of the documents. It was a wanted poster, crisp and clean, wanted dead or alive. Josephine Cross, for the embezzlement of $40,000 from the Texas Pacific Railroad payroll, wife and accomplice to Jebediah Cross. Caleb's blood ran ice cold. Josephine Miller didn't exist. The quiet, gentle woman who had been humming in his kitchen was the wife of Jebediah Cross, one of the most ruthless, bloodthirsty land barons and train robbers in the entire Southwest. The cabin door creaked open. Josie stepped inside, carrying a heavy wooden bucket of water. She stopped dead in her tracks. The bucket slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor, water pooling around her boots as she stared at Caleb, who was kneeling amidst the stolen fortune, the wanted poster clutched in his fist. In a fraction of a second, the gentle connection they had built shattered. Caleb stood up slowly, his face hardening into stone. His right hand hovered instinctively over the butt of his Colt. "Josie Miller," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Or should I say, Mrs. Cross. Josie backed up against the door, her face drained of all color, her chest heaving. "Caleb, please. You don't understand." "I understand that you lied to me," he barked, kicking a stack of bills across the room. "I let you into my home. I fed you. I kept you alive. And you bring the Pinkertons and Jebediah Cross to my doorstep. I'm not his accomplice. I'm his prisoner," she cried out, tears finally breaking past her tough exterior, streaking down her cheeks. "Jebediah killed my father. He forced me into a marriage to take control of my family's land down in San Antonio. He uses that railroad money to hire killers to drive ranchers out of the hill country. I stole the payroll to paralyze his operation. I was trying to get to Fort Worth to give it to a federal judge." Caleb glared at her, his mind racing. It was a wild story. But looking at her desperate, tear-stained face, he remembered the terror in her eyes when he had mentioned taking her into town. "The Pinkertons don't care about your side of the story, Josie," Caleb said coldly. "And Jebediah won't stop until he gets this money back. By taking you in, I've signed my own death warrant." Before Josie could utter another plea, the sharp, unmistakable sound of a Winchester rifle cracking in the distance echoed through the valley. Caleb spun toward the window. Out on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun, were 5 riders on horseback. They were heavily armed, wearing long dusters, and riding hard toward the homestead. The past hadn't just caught up to Josie. It had arrived at Caleb's front door, heavily armed and looking for blood. The 5 riders halted their horses at the crest of the ridge, the morning sun casting long, ominous shadows across the soaked earth. Caleb recognized the man in the center immediately. It wasn't Jebediah Cross, but it was just as bad. The man wore a bowler hat and a silver-studded gun belt over a tailored, mud-splattered coat. It was Elias Thorne's former partner. But to keep the history straight, it was actually a notorious gun-for-hire named Brazos, Bill Higgins. Beside him sat a man holding a badge that gleamed dully in the light, a Pinkerton operative, likely bought and paid for by Cross's railroad money. Caleb didn't wait for them to announce their intentions. He slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the iron bolt into place with a definitive clack. "Get away from the windows," Caleb ordered, his voice devoid of panic, replaced by a cold, frightening calm. He moved swiftly to the fireplace, pulling a lever concealed behind a loose stone. A hidden compartment swung open, revealing a Winchester .73 lever-action rifle and 2 bandoliers of ammunition. Josie scrambled to the center of the room, her hands trembling as she clutched the broken satchel to her chest. "They tracked the horse," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Jebediah's men. They're going to kill us both, Caleb. Give them the money. Give them me." Caleb racked the lever of the Winchester, chambering around with a sharp, metallic snick. He turned to look at her, his jaw set. "A man gives up a woman to a pack of wolves. He ain't a man anymore. And I stopped running from ghosts a long time ago." "Caleb Weston!" a voice boomed from the yard, cutting through the heavy morning air. It was Higgins. "We tracked the embezzler to your property. Send Josephine Cross out with the railroad's money, and we'll leave you to your peace. You have 1 minute, or we burn you out." Caleb knocked out a small, chinking log between the wall timbers, creating a makeshift firing port. He peered through the gap. The men had dismounted and were spreading out, utilizing the cover of Caleb's own water troughs and woodpile. "I don't have a wife to lose this time," Caleb muttered under his breath. He aimed the Winchester and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, filling the small cabin with acrid white smoke. Outside, the Pinkerton agent screamed, dropping his rifle as a .44-40 bullet shattered his collarbone. Hell erupted instantly. A hail of lead tore through the cabin. Bullets chewed through the window shutters, shattering the glass and sending lethal wooden splinters flying across the room. Caleb dropped to a knee, firing methodically through the gun port, working the lever with practiced, deadly precision. He caught another of Higgins's men in the thigh, sending him tumbling into the mud. "They're flanking the rear!" Josie yelled over the deafening gunfire, pointing toward the back door. "The cellar!" Caleb shouted, grabbing her by the arm. He kicked away a braided rug near the cooking stove, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. "Pull it up!" As Josie hoisted the trapdoor, a terrifying crack echoed above them. Higgins and his remaining men had thrown a bundle of kerosene-soaked rags onto the cabin's cedar-shingled roof. Within seconds, the dry wood beneath the damp exterior caught, and flames began to greedily devour Caleb's home, the last remaining monument to his past life. Smoke began to fill the room, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. Caleb fired 2 more suppressive shots through the window, then grabbed the heavy leather satchel of money. He practically shoved Josie down the wooden stairs into the dark, damp storm cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut above them, just as the cabin's front door gave way to a heavy boot. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of turning potatoes and wet earth. "Stay close," Caleb whispered, taking her hand. His rough palm was a stark contrast to her trembling fingers, but his grip was an anchor in the dark. He led her through the cramped space to the far wall, where a narrow, reinforced tunnel sloped downward. Caleb had dug it 3 years ago to drain floodwaters into the nearby creek bed, never imagining it would serve as an escape route. They crawled through the muddy, suffocating tunnel for what felt like hours, the muffled sounds of the cabin collapsing in a fiery ruin echoing behind them. When they finally emerged into the blinding daylight, they were 1/2 mile down the ravine, hidden by dense thickets of mesquite. Caleb gave a sharp, 2-fingered whistle. A moment later, Buster, who had been spooked by the gunfire and broken his corral fence, trotted out from the brush, his coat slick with sweat. "We're going to Fort Worth," Caleb said, hauling Josie up onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. "You said you needed a federal judge. We ride hard. We make the city by tomorrow night." The journey was brutal. They rode east across the sprawling, unforgiving Texas plains, avoiding the main stagecoach trails. That night, they camped without a fire beneath a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. Caleb sat watch, the Winchester resting across his lap. Josie sat beside him, shivering despite the heavy wool blanket wrapped around her. "You lost your home today," she said softly, the guilt heavy in her throat. "Everything you built. Because of me." Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the dark horizon. "It was just wood and nails, Josie. The people who made it a home have been gone a long time." He paused, his voice softening just a fraction. "Besides, sitting in that cabin, waiting to die of old age, that wasn't living. You reminded me that I'm still breathing." Josie reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, turning his face toward hers. The moonlight caught the tears pooling in her dark eyes. In the quiet isolation of the prairie, the space between them vanished. Caleb leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was desperate, bruised, and fiercely alive. It was the taste of rain, gunpowder, and an undeniable promise that neither of them was going to die alone. They arrived in Fort Worth at dusk the following day. The city was a booming, chaotic hub of cattlemen, gamblers, and railroad tycoons. The stockyard smelled of manure and blood, and the notorious Red Light District, Hell's Half Acre, was already coming alive with the sound of tin pianos and drunken shouts. Caleb knew they couldn't just walk into the courthouse. With a $40,000 Pinkerton bounty on Josie's head, every lawman with an empty pocket would be gunning for them. They needed an intermediary, someone with enough authority to bypass the corrupt local deputies and get the evidence directly to the federal circuit. They tied Buster in a shadowed alley behind the White Elephant Saloon. Caleb instructed Josie to wait in the shadows while he went inside to find Marshal Jim Courtright. Courtright was a legendary, long-haired lawman in Fort Worth, feared, respected, and supposedly an enemy of the railroad monopolies. Caleb pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was thick with cigar smoke and the clatter of poker chips. He found Courtright sitting in a corner booth, a silver star pinned to his vest, nursing a glass of rye. Caleb approached, keeping his hand near his Colt. "Marshal Courtright, I need to speak with you about Jebediah Cross. I have evidence of federal embezzlement and bribery, and I have the witness to prove it." Courtright looked up from under his wide-brimmed hat, his eyes cold and calculating. He slowly set his glass down. "Cross is a powerful man, stranger. You bring those kinds of accusations in my town, you better have the paper to back it up." "I have the paper, and the missing railroad payroll," Caleb replied, leaning in close. "I need you to escort us to Judge John C. Lynch, tonight." Courtright nodded slowly, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Bring the witness and the money to the livery stable at the end of Rusk Street. It's quiet there. I'll have a wagon ready to take us to the judge's residence." Caleb slipped back out into the alley, a knot of unease twisting in his gut. Something in Courtright's eyes hadn't sat right, but they were out of options. He gathered Josie, and together they made their way through the muddy, darkened streets to the livery stable. The stable was cavernous, smelling of hay and old leather. A single lantern swung from the rafters, casting long, erratic shadows. "Marshal!" Caleb called out, stepping into the light, pushing Josie slightly behind him. The heavy barn doors behind them slammed shut. From the shadows, men stepped forward, their revolvers drawn, and walking out from one of the horse stalls, wearing an immaculate black suit and carrying an ivory-handled cane, was Jebediah Cross. He was older than Caleb expected, with a shock of silver hair and eyes as flat and black as a shark's. Standing right beside him was Marshal Jim Courtright, holding a double-barreled shotgun. "Jim Courtright works for me, Mr. Weston," Jebediah said, his voice a smooth, aristocratic drawl. "As does half the law in this miserable state. Did you really think you could steal from me, Josephine, and find justice in a Texas town?" Josie stepped out from behind Caleb, her spine stiff, her chin held high despite the terror radiating from her. "You're a monster, Jebediah. You killed my father. You ruined my family." "I am a businessman, my dear," Jebediah sneered. "And you are a thief. Hand over the satchel, Mr. Weston. If you do, I'll grant you a quick death." Josephine, however, is coming back to San Antonio to learn how to be an obedient wife. Caleb looked at the 5 armed men, then at Courtright, and finally at Jebediah. He slowly unbuckled the leather satchel from his shoulder, letting it drop to the hay-covered floor. "You're right about one thing, Cross," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I don't expect to find justice in this town." Before the heavy satchel even hit the ground, Caleb moved. He didn't draw his Colt. Instead, he kicked the lantern resting on a nearby barrel, sending it smashing directly into Marshal Courtright's chest. The burning oil ignited the lawman's vest instantly. Courtright screamed, dropping the shotgun. In the ensuing chaos, Caleb drew his revolver. The tight confines of the livery stable erupted into a deafening roar of gunfire. Caleb fired 3 times in rapid succession, dropping 2 of Cross's hired guns before they could aim. Jebediah cursed, raising a hidden Derringer pistol toward Josie. "Caleb!" she screamed. Instead of diving for cover, Josie scooped up Courtright's dropped shotgun from the dirt. With a furious, primal cry, she aimed it squarely at the man who had tormented her and pulled the trigger. The blast blew Jebediah Cross backward off his feet, his chest ruined, his reign of terror ended in a spray of red mist. Caleb dove, tackling the last remaining gunman to the ground, disarming him with a brutal strike to the jaw. Silence fell over the stable, broken only by the crackle of a small hay fire starting near the broken lantern, and the heavy, ragged breathing of Caleb and Josie. Caleb stood slowly, wiping a streak of blood from a graze on his cheek. He looked at Josie. She had dropped the shotgun, her hands shaking violently, staring at Jebediah's lifeless body. Caleb walked over to her, wrapping his arms tightly around her trembling frame, pulling her head to his chest. "It's over," he whispered into her hair, kissing the crown of her head. "It's finally over." The following morning, with Jebediah dead and Courtright exposed, the power dynamic in Fort Worth shifted. Caleb and Josie delivered the stolen $40,000 and the ledger of bribes directly to a highly publicized grand jury under the protection of Charles Siringo, a legendary, uncorrupted Pinkerton agent who had come to town to investigate Cross's railroad fraud. With her coercion proven, Josephine's warrants were cleared. She was a free woman. Standing on the bustling platform of the Texas Pacific Railroad, Josie held a ticket to St. Louis. She had family there. A fresh start. Caleb stood beside her, his weathered face, looking out at the iron tracks. "Train leaves in 10 minutes, he said softly, the old familiar ache of loneliness creeping back into his chest. Josie looked at the ticket in her hand, then up at the rugged, quiet cowboy who had pulled her from the mud, fought an army for her, and reminded her what it felt like to be loved. Slowly, deliberately, Josie tore the train ticket in half, letting the pieces fall onto the wooden platform. Caleb turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you doing?" "A man lost his cabin recently," Josie said, a brilliant, beautiful smile breaking across her face. "I hear he needs help rebuilding it. Someone to keep the hearth warm." Caleb's tough exterior finally melted completely. He reached out, pulling her into his arms right there on the crowded platform, not caring who saw. He had lost everything to the harsh Texas frontier, but the storm had brought him something better. It had brought him a future. If the storm of this story captured your heart, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button to support more wild Western tales, and share this video with someone who loves a romance filled with grit, twists, and redemption. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling adventure. What should we write about next? Tell us in the comments.